Namaste. We're going to continue our lecture today on Sankhya philosophy, go into it a little bit deeper. Hope you all saw the first video on introduction to Sankhya. Now we're going to go into comparing Sankhya philosophy with other philosophies that are out there, and how does this work, and how do we store this idea in our brains and wrap our heads around it and where we're at. So we can start off just by saying, yes, Samkhya is dualism. It's dualism because the basic foundation, the very premise, is that consciousness and matter merge together and create life. There's a lot of other philosophies out there. You can have non-dualism, which non-dualism is really, once you dig into non-dualism, it says that, yeah, everything is consciousness. Everything is consciousness. It gets rid of the concept that Prakriti exists, which is a valid assumption, a valid premise, because once you graduate out of Prakriti, once you become realized and you realize that everything is consciousness, then you know that Prakriti is no longer in your view. So you can take a non-dualistic perspective. But non-dualism is really a progression past dualism, as you can see that from the name. It's once you're dualist, and then beyond dualism becomes non-dualism. But we have to understand dualism, Samkhya, first. You also have two concepts of monotheism and monism. Monotheism is the concept of one God. We have one God, and the God provides everything for us, and this world we live in was created by God, and we worship that God. And monism is the concept that everything is God, that the whole world is God. The God is not separate from us, that we have we are part of God. He is part of us. We are all connected together. And all of these four main philosophies, as you go into pretty much any religion, you can divide those religions up into dualism, non-dualism, monism, and monotheism. And that'll be my premise. And as we go from here, let us just say, well, non-dualism is really just looking at Purusha. You're saying, okay, we're past dualism. Dualism is Purusha and Prakriti merging together. Yeah. Monism says that everything is God. Everything that we see is God. We are God. There is nothing that is not God. You see the stars, you see the grass, you see God in everything. And monism really is looking at Prakriti. You're saying, okay, we live in this world of Prakriti. Prakriti is nature. God created nature. So this becomes a monistic philosophy that, yeah, I don't want to negate it, but it's a different way of looking at it. And monotheism is really looking at the God that created Prakriti. It's not everything is God, but God created Prakriti. And so that is the God that's above us that created all of this, and we're living in that world. Whereas monotheism, or compared to monism, where everything is God. So let's compare and contrast these a little bit. It's very subtle but very important for the understandings. And I think starting from this angle will get us to understand really where we're at, where we're going, how these pieces fit in. But before we do that, let's just back up and we'll just blow everything open and say Purusha is consciousness. Let's find a good color. Consciousness. Sioussness. And I'm going off on Sankhya philosophy now. Prakriti is nature. So if we look at Purusha's consciousness, it's like my consciousness, my witness, my awareness, my that's me. Yeah, your consciousness, your self, your awareness is a separate dot. And consciousness, as we all have separate witnesses to all of our events, consciousness is many. We are all individual sparks of light. We are all individual consciousness. And you run into this sometimes with deep philosophy, deep meditation. People are afraid that when they go into deep meditation, they will lose themselves. There is a fear that if everything is God, once you merge and become one with everything, you no longer have your individuality. But that is not what Samkhya is saying. Samkhya is saying everybody has their own consciousness. Everybody is a witness to their own events. But on the contrast that with Prakriti, there is only one nature. Nature is all one. The universe we live in was created by God. You could easily say God created this world. He created this world through his consciousness. Because if we're consciousness and we're made in God's image and everything is either consciousness of Purusha or Prakriti, then the enlightened beings, the gods, must also have a consciousness. And their consciousness must be equivalent to ours and eternal and forever because consciousness is non-changing, eternal, forever. So therefore, the God's consciousness that created this world he created this through his mental power. The difference is that the higher gods just have more mental awareness, more power, more prowess, more ability to create. You can see in our world, different people have different abilities. People can create. We can plant seeds. We can grow things. We desire to create. We desire to grow. We continue to want to build things. And that's just our nature. As you get beyond Prakriti and you become consciousness, yet you still want to create. So what do the higher gods do? They create this world. They create Prakriti, the whole time-space continuum that we're abiding in, that you could also call Maya, Maya, which is often translated as delusion, because in Maya, we're living in a world of delusion. Or I just saw an article saying, theorizing that we're living in a simulated reality. It's all kind of saying the same thing, but we come back to Samkhya language and that we're all living in Prakriti, inside this Prakriti, inside this illusion, inside this bubble. You can imagine we're very experienced living in bubbles nowadays, that we are going through our lives in this bubble, but this is a big bubble, probably 311 trillion year old bubble for the life of Brahma. And then he will pass the baton on to somebody else, and another higher God will create a new bubble, and we'll live in that bubble. until we progress on out. So Maya, nature is one. Consciousness is many. Nature is one. And monism says, or monotheism says God created the world, and we need to worship God and thank Him for creating this world we live in. Very valid, very necessary. That is, most of the religions are monotheistic and saying yes, that is how the world of Prakriti works. Monism says that everything is God and God is everything, and that is close. What it is missing is that it is negating the concept of consciousness. If you say God is just everything, so God is also my consciousness, God is a witness of my events, as well as everything else, then that negates our individual consciousness in the world. So that's why monism really doesn't even look this way. Monism is saying, okay, we're just not going to look, or monotheism says we're just not even going to look at Purusha. We're struggling living in this world of Maya. We're not going to look past Purusha. We're not going to look at that. Let's just deal with what we have in front of us, and everything else will take care of itself. Monism really negates the concept of Purusha. Non-dualism really negates the idea of Prakriti, which is, since Prakriti is temporary and Maya illusion and just one bubble of nature, it's valid to negate it, but then again, it's very difficult because how do you negate everything that you is telling you? Your senses, everything is just telling you Purusha exists. So to say Prakriti exists, to say Prakriti does not exist is a very challenging path. And that's really why the Yoga Sutras are written. The Yoga Sutras are written so that we can get to this step by a very well-defined set of rules so that we can find that we're not uh, trapped in this bubble. But it's an arduous path, and but it's a path that has been followed by rishis and sages over eternity, and so that's why it's codified, and that's really how Yoga Sutra mesh. It's a path to get from dualism to non-dualism, but you have to understand dualism in order to understand what that path is telling us. So uh, with that, let's switch gears. Let me erase all of this and we'll start over. So now we can say Purusha, our consciousness is many. We all have an individual consciousness. And Prakriti is nature, which was created by God. If you go into the yoga literature, God is also Ishvara. Ishvara is the specific name for the creator God that created the bubble that we're living in. And so we have Ishvar, the God, created this nature bubble. And we have two main concepts I want to present here. We have the concept of realization, which is, or you could call it self-realization, which is really the goal of yoga. The goal of yoga is to realize yourself. Realize what self? And it's really to realize a self is pure, eternal, unlimited consciousness. If you can realize a self is consciousness as consciousness, then you will be able to live in a non-dualistic world and be able to negate the effects of Prakriti. The other piece you could look at and say, okay, I'm looking for salvation. That's the other piece. Besides self-realization is salvation. Salvation basically is the concept that we're saved. What are we saved from? We're saved from the torment of an afterlife. If you're saved, you give your life over, you give a good life, you're saved, you go to heaven, you live in heaven, and you you stay there, or you come back, and that is the whole concept of karma. And you live a good life, you after you pass, you go to heaven, you stay in heaven based on your past karma. But at some point in heaven is still trapped in Prakriti because you haven't yet realized just because you've passed, just because you've given up the body, and we can see that through the Sankhya, and we'll talk about that probably at another lecture. But if you give away your body and you're still trapped in the Mula Prakriti, then because you haven't realized yet that everything is consciousness, then you're just still in heaven. But after a while, yeah, possibly you get bored, you have latent desires, vasanas. Introducing the concept of vasanas here. Vasanas are your latent desires. And the point of Prakriti, of nature, is for us to be able to live out our desires. You have these desires if you pass and you have a desire to have an ice cream cone. Once you pass, you've given up your sense perceptions, your organs of motor action, you can't have an ice cream cone anymore. The only way to get an ice cream cone is to descend back into a body, and then you can experience that again. And as long as you have desires, Prakriti is designed for us to be able to satisfy those desires. The benevolent God has given us this world so that we can experience it and experience ourselves. And so the vasanas, the desires, are what continue to bring us back. And our karma, our momentum from all of our past actions, is what defines the conditions that we're in when we come back. And so we all come back in different places based on our past momentum of actions and our karma. And we all come back for different reasons, our vasanas, because we have these desires. And once we extinguish our karma, once we have no longer have any latent subtle desires, then we can graduate off of Prakriti. So that is a quick introduction to the four types of models where self-realization and salvation come in and how it relates to many of the current religions in the world. We'll let it go with that. Thank you all. Hope we can continue the series. Namaste.